We spent a lot of this lesson discussing how to stay engaged in difficult conversations and how to manage your emotions well, even when it's really challenging. And I want to end by sharing how to set up a conversation for success and how to be direct in your communication. In this part, I want to share a recipe for setting up a conversation and engaging in difficult situations. Much of this comes from a really helpful model called the Subject Behavior Impact, or SBI model for short, made popular by the Center for Creative Leadership. Now, we can't always choose when we'll find ourselves in a difficult situation, but the more you can prepare for these situations, the more you can engage constructively. Setting up a conversation for success starts with just that, setting it up well. And there are three main ingredients for setting up situations well. First is to let people know and get their buy-in to actually have a difficult conversation with you. This can be as simple as an email or a Slack message that simply says, hey, would you have a few minutes to talk later about a situation that we've just had together? The point here is that we're getting their permission. We're getting some buy-in to actually engage in the conversation. Think about this as getting that permission to start the conversation. Once you've shared the context for the conversation, it's great to start with what your intention of the conversation is going to be. For example, let's say that you want to share with your boss concerns about the switching priorities she seems to keep having about one of your projects. After you've asked her for some time to discuss the goals and talk about the priorities, you might say, hey, my intention for this conversation is to better understand our goals because I want to make sure that we're aligned. Sharing your intention can disarm someone from thinking that you're setting up a conversation just to accuse them of something or just to disagree with them. So thinking back to your difficult situation that you identified in part 2, pause the video and write down for yourself, what will your intention statement be? And finally, very tactical to setting up this conversation can be to actually share what is going to be the process of the conversation. You might share that your intention is to come to consensus and that you'd like to spend 20 minutes discussing the challenges and the final 10 minutes moving towards action items. And the final step would then be to ask them, how does that sound? This again helps get their buy-in to the conversation that you want to have with them. Now, this recipe also works for when you are being asked to engage in a difficult conversation. Before jumping in, you could actually ask someone, hey, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. What is the goal of this conversation and how do we want to agree to have it? The main point is that you can be direct in your communication even when you are the one not setting it up. Now, once you've engaged in a difficult conversation, whether you've planned it or not, 3 specific elements are particularly important to keep in mind. So the first one is that as we become stressed or overwhelmed or frustrated by the conversation that we're having, we tend to make really big statements. Things like, you never listen to me, or you always do this. And these statements are, first and foremost, they're not often true. And second of all, they are likely to cause the other person to become very defensive. So the best way to keep people from being defensive and kind of keep them feeling a little bit more calm is to actually focus on the specific facts and the data of what actually happened. Think of sharing the data of what is going on and not necessarily how you feel or how you interpreted it. So let's take an example. Say someone gave you some feedback that you weren't proactive enough. This is likely probably hard to hear and doesn't really tell you anything about what you're actually doing wrong. So the person sharing this with you would be much better off saying, hey, I've noticed in the past 2 projects, I've had to ask you to get started. Now, that still may be hard for you to hear, but you at least know what it is that they're actually talking about. Second step here is to share the impact of what's actually going on. Now, this may be the impact their behavior is having on you. It could be the impact it's having on our ability to meet our goals. And it might even be the impact it's having on their reputation. No matter what the impact of the behavior, sharing this is a key step for getting someone's attention and making sure that they understand why it's important that they actually listen to you. So let's continue our example. So you've received this feedback and you understand now that you're not as proactive as you could be. Now, once we get clarity on the data and the specific facts of what happened, we could then ask them to share the impact that it's having. They might say that it's delaying our work, or they could also say that it's making it difficult to collaborate with you. Either way, this will help you know how to respond and what actions to take on this feedback in the future. And the last step in any difficult conversation is to make sure that you're asking questions. So we discussed in part 3 about being curious, and we want to make sure that after we've shared the data and the impact, that we actually follow up with their perspective. We want to hear their side of the story, and we want to stay curious about where their differences are at. Again, the goal of these conversations is not to win or to convince anyone, but rather to find some understanding and hopefully even create some sense of connection. So these tips are useful in person for sure, but super helpful when we're remote and far more likely to make assumptions about them.